Something has been pressing against your attention all week, and the strange part is that you may have felt it before you had any language for it. The days have carried an unusual contradiction, as though life has been demanding more from you, while somehow giving you less certainty about where your energy should actually go. Even the smallest interactions may have seemed slightly distorted. Your phone may have felt different when it buzzed. Messages may have carried an odd emotional weight. Conversations may have stretched on without reaching a meaningful conclusion. Arrangements that seemed settled may have moved without warning. Beneath ordinary responsibilities, there may have been a persistent sense of interference, almost like invisible noise following you from one task into the next. Look back over the last several days and notice whether the pattern becomes easier to see. Perhaps you sent someone a message and watched it remain unanswered longer than you expected. Perhaps a meeting was moved once, then moved again. Maybe Monday morning began with absolute certainty about something you needed to accomplish, only for Tuesday afternoon to arrive with that urgency strangely drained away, leaving you wondering why the task had mattered so much only a day earlier. By themselves, these moments are small. None of them needs to become a catastrophe. Yet when several of them collect inside the same week, your nervous system begins noticing what your conscious mind may dismiss. It starts to feel as though the week cannot settle on a direction, and every time you adjust to one rhythm, the rhythm changes again. Today is August 16th, 2026, and there is a reason the atmosphere has felt crowded. Imagine trying to hear one important voice while 5 radios fill the room with different stations at the same time. That is remarkably close to the energetic structure unfolding now. 5 distinct planetary movements are converging during this week, and by Wednesday, 5 particular zodiac signs are positioned to receive something tangible through the confusion. It may arrive as a message, an offer, or an opportunity, but the important distinction is that it has substance. It provides a clear signal in a period otherwise defined by competing signals. Before this video is over, I will tell you which 5 signs are involved. Stay with the sequence first, because understanding why this week can contain uncertainty and unmistakable clarity at the same moment is more important than simply hearing 5 names. Before you know the answer, comment your zodiac sign below. Notice what your intuition says before explanation has a chance to influence it. If 5 signs are already forming in your mind, keep that prediction with you for the next few minutes instead of jumping forward. The significance of what is happening depends on understanding why these signs are singled out by the structure itself. Without that context, the final reveal can sound accidental. Once you understand the planetary rulership behind it, the pattern becomes much easier to recognize. The first piece begins with Mars. Mars represents momentum, initiative, desire, and the instinct to act directly. Right now, Mars is caught in a difficult 90-degree relationship with Neptune, the planet associated with dreams, blurred edges, uncertainty, and boundaries that seem to dissolve when you try to define them. When these two energies meet through this uncomfortable angle, effort can lose its normal sense of traction. You may know exactly how it feels. Imagine attempting to run through deep water. Your body is still working, your muscles are still pushing, yet the force you produce does not translate into the speed you expect because the environment absorbs part of every movement. That is the quality surrounding forward action now. Deadlines may not collapse completely, but they can drift. Intentions may not disappear, but they can become difficult to read. Someone can tell you one thing while carrying another meaning underneath it, and this does not automatically mean deception. Neptune can make people uncertain about their own intentions before they ever communicate those intentions to somebody else. At the same time, Mars is involved with Pluto through a quincunx, an uneasy aspect built around adjustment rather than straightforward confrontation. This is one reason the emotional texture of the week is difficult to summarize with a single word. A quincunx does not necessarily give you an obvious opponent or a clearly defined problem that can simply be defeated. Instead, it creates pressure that keeps asking for modification without immediately revealing what must be modified. You can feel that something needs to change while remaining unable to name the exact thing. That can become psychologically exhausting because the mind naturally wants a target. It wants to know what to fix, whom to confront, what decision to make, and where the obstacle is located. This configuration does not necessarily provide that convenience. Instead, it can leave you carrying a background tension that follows you through otherwise ordinary moments. So the overwhelming quality of this week is not coming from one dramatic source. There is fog around action. There is pressure toward an adjustment that has not yet fully identified itself, and these forces are overlapping. It is closer to three weather systems moving across the same territory during the same 5-day period than to one single storm arriving and leaving. You may already have lived through a very precise example without connecting it to the astrology. Imagine that earlier in the week you were speaking with someone on the phone. During the conversation, an agreement seemed perfectly understandable. You ended the call, satisfied, and believed everything had been settled. Then an hour passed, and suddenly you found yourself trying to reconstruct exactly what had been decided. The details seemed softer than they had while you were speaking. That experience captures the Mars and Neptune dynamic. Neptune is positioned directly across from Mars, and decisions made under immediate momentum can lose definition after the moment passes. This does not mean your memory is suddenly betraying you. It means this is a particularly useful week to create external clarity instead of trusting every agreement to remain equally clear in your mind. Write important details down, even if you normally would not consider that necessary. Give decisions a concrete form while their edges are still visible. Yet, while Mars is caught in these complicated exchanges with Neptune and Pluto, another movement has been developing almost silently. The Moon has continued advancing toward its first quarter phase, which arrives on August 19th. Astrologers traditionally describe this point of the lunar cycle as the crisis of action. That phrase can sound more frightening than its actual meaning. It does not necessarily describe a dramatic event or something breaking apart. It describes the point where reflection is no longer enough. The lunar cycle begins applying pressure toward movement, even when you do not feel completely prepared to move. Think about what you have been collecting internally during the previous week and a half. There may have been a thought that appeared briefly and then returned later. There may have been a conversation whose significance you only partly understood at the time. Somewhere in the background, a choice may have been developing without reaching completion. Some of those pieces may trace back to the eclipse on the 12th. They have been gathering quietly, and the first quarter moon changes the question. Instead of allowing you to continue collecting pieces indefinitely, it confronts you with what those pieces are going to become. What will you actually do with what you now know? That demand arrives whether Mars feels certain or not. This is the central contradiction of the week. One planetary force makes progress feel slowed, blurred, and difficult to measure, while another insists that a direction must nevertheless be chosen. Emotionally, that can create a very specific kind of discomfort. Part of you may want to wait until every uncertainty disappears. Another part may already know that waiting for perfect certainty is no longer possible. The breakthrough potential exists inside that collision. It does not appear after the tension has conveniently vanished. It can emerge because the tension forces something that has remained unresolved to reach a turning point. This is also why astrologers have used the language of crisis for this lunar phase for centuries. The older meaning of crisis was not identical to the alarming meaning people often hear today. Historically, the word could describe a decisive turning point within a process that was already underway. Consider an illness reaching the stage where a fever finally breaks in one direction or another. The first quarter moon carries a comparable symbolism. Its message is not that something has necessarily gone wrong. Its message is that something has developed far enough that remaining suspended between possibilities becomes increasingly difficult. During this lunar cycle, August 19th is precisely that threshold. But there is another layer underneath the louder Mars story, and overlooking it would mean missing the very part of this week that explains what happens next. While the difficult configurations generate noise, two more supportive planetary relationships are taking shape beneath them. Mercury, associated with communication, thinking, language, and the exchange of information, enters a trine with Saturn on the 17th. A trine allows energy to move with greater ease, and Saturn gives form, seriousness, responsibility, and weight. Together, Mercury and Saturn can transform a conversation from something casual and disposable into something that carries consequence. Words become more deliberate. Statements become easier to take seriously. What might normally evaporate as small talk can acquire structure. At the same time, Venus forms a sextile with Jupiter, Venus governs connection and relationships, while Jupiter expands, enlarges, and brings a more generous quality to whatever it touches. Their sextile functions like a cooperative opening between relational energy and expansion. Unlike the harder Mars configurations, trines and sextiles rarely need to announce themselves dramatically. They can operate without creating spectacle. A door can simply become available while everyone is looking toward the louder disturbance somewhere else. That contrast matters enormously. Mars with Neptune and Pluto creates the interference. Mercury with Saturn and Venus with Jupiter provide two distinct frequencies of clarity inside that interference. Those quieter alignments are the reason 5 signs can encounter something concrete during this week, while other parts of the zodiac remain occupied with sorting through uncertainty. You can learn to recognize these supportive signals before you even know which signs they affect most strongly. Pay close attention to changes in how people speak to you. Under Mercury and Saturn, communication often becomes more intentional. Someone may slow down and choose language with unusual care. A person might return to a subject they would normally abandon. A conversation that could have remained vague may suddenly become serious enough to carry a decision, a commitment, or a clearer understanding. The Venus and Jupiter influence has a different emotional temperature. It tends to feel warmer, more open and more generous than circumstances strictly require. Someone may give more than the minimum. An interaction may contain a level of goodwill that seems almost larger than the practical situation calls for. Neither alignment needs dramatic music around it, neither arrives announcing that an important moment has begun. In fact, their subtlety is precisely why you could overlook them. The louder Mars tension naturally captures attention because human beings are trained to notice friction first. The supportive opening can pass quietly beside it unless you know what kind of signal you are listening for. This is where the 5 signs finally begin to emerge from the larger picture, because these planetary connections do not translate identically for everyone. Mercury directly rules Gemini and Virgo. That rulership gives Mercury's trine with Saturn a particular precision for those 2 signs. Instead of experiencing the transit only as general atmospheric weather, Gemini and Virgo can experience it more like communication carrying their specific address. Saturn, meanwhile, rules Capricorn. That means the same Mercury. Saturn trine connects with Capricorn from the Saturn side of the relationship. The alignment, therefore, has signs already connected to both ends of its structure. Mercury points directly toward Gemini and Virgo, while Saturn points toward Capricorn. Venus provides the second pathway. Venus rules Taurus and Libra. When Venus enters this cooperative sextile with the expansive generosity of Jupiter, Taurus and Libra are not simply standing beneath a passing influence in the same way everyone else is. Through rulership, Venus reaches directly into the experience of those 2 signs, making the opening feel more personally relevant and potentially more concrete. That gives us 5 signs connected through the 2 quieter alignments. Gemini, Virgo, and Capricorn are tied into the Mercury-Saturn relationship. Taurus and Libra are tied into the Venus-Jupiter relationship. The reason these 5 emerge is not that the sky randomly chooses favorites for a few days. It comes from planetary rulership, a framework astrologers have relied upon for centuries to describe why the same planetary movement can manifest differently across different signs. Understanding that mechanism changes the emotional meaning of the entire week. You are no longer looking at 5 arbitrary names selected after the fact. You are looking at how a shared celestial pattern is filtered through different planetary relationships. The sky itself does not stop and compose 5 separate personalized letters. The planets continue moving according to the same larger pattern. Rulership functions more like the lens through which that common movement becomes distinct when it reaches different signs. Imagine rain falling across one area. The water itself does not decide what it will become after touching the ground, yet the response depends entirely on what receives it. A cultivated field absorbs that rain in one way, while a paved parking lot responds in another. The rainfall is the same, but the environment changes its expression. That is the principle operating here, and once you see it, the strange combination of noise and clarity surrounding this week begins to make sense. The confusion has not disappeared. The pressure has not suddenly become simple, and the first quarter moon is still moving toward its decisive point on August 19th. But beneath all of that movement, the quieter signals are already forming, and understanding how those signals reach Gemini, Virgo, Capricorn, Taurus, and Libra is what prepares us for the next part of this pattern. There is an important distinction you need to understand before deciding whether this week is actually bringing something meaningful toward you, because Mercury moving harmoniously with Saturn creates the opening, but Gemini, Virgo, and Capricorn are positioned to receive that opening in a particularly usable form, almost like rainfall reaching ground prepared to hold the water instead of watching it disappear across the surface. And before looking at each of these signs separately, you need to know what you are actually watching for. Because hearing that an offer may arrive can easily become vague enough to mean almost anything unless you understand the form it is likely to take. For some people, yes, the manifestation could be as obvious as a professional opportunity delivered through an email, but that is not the only possibility, and very often the important moment appears in a much less predictable package. Someone you never expected to hear from may suddenly contact you. During a meeting, another person may say something seemingly simple that reveals an option nobody had previously placed on the table. You could receive an invitation connected with something you privately wanted but never directly requested. The key is communication, because Mercury forming a trine with Saturn supports language that carries seriousness, intention, and structure. For these 5 signs, what becomes available this week is therefore especially likely to travel through words, whether those words arrive through an actual conversation, a written communication, or a more formal request. Taurus and Libra receive a different variation because Venus forming a sextile with Jupiter emphasizes generosity and relationships, so what reaches them may emerge through another person or an existing connection rather than through an official document. It is equally important to understand what you probably should not expect, because your expectations determine which signals your attention recognizes and which ones disappear into the background. These openings usually are not situations you have to aggressively pursue, repeatedly negotiate, or exhaust yourself trying to manufacture. If you notice yourself forcing one particular result with unusual intensity during this week, consider the possibility that the resistance itself is telling you something. You may be pushing deeper into the Mars and Neptune confusion instead of approaching either of the supportive openings already available. When the correct door appears during this period, it is more likely to move with noticeably less resistance once you actually reach it. The most concentrated period to watch runs from August 17th through August 19th. During those 3 days, pay slightly closer attention to incoming communication than you normally would. You do not need to stare at your phone or turn every notification into a prophecy. The point is simply to become more present. Make a quiet agreement with yourself now that you will actually notice what crosses your screen rather than moving through messages mechanically. A narrow opportunity window can sometimes pass unnoticed for an extremely ordinary reason. The opportunity arrived, but it arrived while your attention was divided, and by the end of the day it had been buried beneath everything else demanding a response. Gemini. Your connection with this begins through Mercury itself, because Mercury rules your sign and its trine with Saturn can bring movement into an area where you have been waiting quietly for longer than you probably admit. Think back to a conversation that began several weeks ago and then seemed to lose momentum. Think about something you wrote, presented, proposed, or sent outward and eventually stopped expecting anyone to answer. The combination of Mercury's movement with Saturn's solidity can bring that unfinished thread back. But the difference is that it may return carrying significance it did not have before. Instead of someone casually acknowledging what you said and moving on, there can finally be evidence that your words are being treated seriously. Virgo, Mercury, rules you as well, but the experience is likely to feel much closer to the machinery of your everyday life. Look toward your work, your routines, your systems, and especially the responsibilities you consistently handle without receiving much visible acknowledgement for the energy required to keep everything functioning. Something you believed nobody had noticed may finally be recognized. Do not necessarily expect dramatic praise or public celebration. The recognition described here is quieter and potentially much more useful. What matters is that someone with enough influence to affect your circumstances demonstrates that they understand the value of what you have created or maintained. For both Gemini and Virgo, there is one detail that can help you separate an ordinary interaction from the signal you're looking for, and that detail is structure. The communication may feel more formal than what you usually receive. Instead of somebody throwing out a quick casual question, they may schedule an actual conversation. Instead of sending a loose text, they may choose email. Instead of improvising their thoughts while talking to you, they may arrive having clearly considered what they intend to say. That preparation carries Saturn's signature. Do not automatically interpret seriousness as emotional distance. During this transit, increased formality can mean exactly the reverse. Someone may be preparing because they consider you important enough to approach carefully. Taurus, your doorway is different because Venus rules your sign, and Venus is actively involved in this week's supportive movement. Watch for contact carrying friendliness rather than pressure. Someone from your past could reappear. A connection could emerge through someone you already know. Another person may simply return to your world, but this time there may be generosity connected with their return. Jupiter enlarges the territory touched by Venus, which means an interaction that initially looks modest can develop beyond its first appearance. A small favor can become the beginning of a meaningful partnership. A relaxed suggestion to reconnect can unexpectedly develop into a genuine proposal. The important emotional clue is that the interaction may not initially appear to require anything from you. Venus and Jupiter approach gently. This is why the coffee invitation matters. The core matters. Even the 5-minute conversation you would ordinarily postpone until next week deserves your attention during this window. The opportunity may be contained inside the gesture itself, rather than arriving with a separate announcement explaining what the gesture will eventually become. And Taurus, if your immediate instinct is to inspect kindness for conditions hidden underneath it, this particular week may bring that reflex into focus. You may have learned to protect yourself by asking what another person really wants whenever they offer something freely. Yet not every generous hand contains a concealed demand. Jupiter's function in this alignment is expansion itself rather than manipulation. Your challenge is not blind trust. It is allowing warmth to remain what it appears to be for long enough to discover where the interaction genuinely leads before deciding in advance that generosity must contain the trap. Libra. Venus rules you too, but the same Venus and Jupiter sextile carries another emotional shape into your week. Your story may be less about an entirely new possibility entering from nowhere, and more about a tension that has already existed finally beginning to move toward an outcome that favors you. You may have spent recent weeks negotiating a relationship, working through a shared choice, or repeatedly modifying your own position because maintaining harmony seemed easier than allowing conflict to grow. Between August 17th and August 19th, notice whether the person on the opposite side suddenly becomes more flexible. The shift does not necessarily happen because you increased the pressure. Jupiter can amplify generosity itself, and someone you have been trying to persuade may suddenly become more receptive to the very thing you have been suggesting all along. If there is a request you have repeatedly postponed, whether it involves a raise, a boundary, or another need you have convinced yourself not to voice, this period supports finally putting it into words. There is a deeper emotional release inside this for Libra. Because you are often the person quietly maintaining equilibrium. You detect tension early, make adjustments before anyone else understands why they are necessary, and sometimes carry the invisible labor of keeping everyone positioned somewhere near the middle. This week does not require you to perform that balancing act entirely by yourself. The turning point may simply be recognizing that another person is finally prepared to move toward you without requiring you to design every part of the compromise first. Then there is Capricorn, the final sign among these 5, and perhaps the most structurally obvious because Saturn itself rules you. Mercury's trine with Saturn is unlikely to reach you through chaos or impulsiveness. Its arrival matches the language Capricorn understands: deliberate, organized, formal. It may happen according to somebody else's timing rather than yours, and it may come through an official route instead of an informal exchange. An unexpected phone call is possible, so is a formal offer. You may receive written confirmation connected with something you have pursued far longer than most people around you realize. Capricorn often becomes suspicious when circumstances appear to resolve too easily, but what arrives here is unlikely to feel weightless. There may be clear terms. There may be a defined timeline. There may simply be enough concrete structure surrounding the communication that you cannot reasonably dismiss it as imagination or hopeful interpretation. That is why the feeling may be less like sudden luck and more like compensation for effort already invested. Even then, you may catch yourself searching automatically for the hidden problem. You might reread the conditions and then reread them again because some part of you expects patience to be followed by another test. That instinct does not need to be condemned, but during this particular week it may continue operating after it is finished protecting you. Saturn responding to the patience of a Saturn-ruled sign does not have to be a trap. It can simply be the structure finally producing the result you believed it should eventually produce if you remained committed long enough. For this moment, the period of waiting reaches its conclusion, and if your sign has not been named among these 5, you may now be wondering whether the astrology of this week somehow leaves you outside the story. It does not. 7 signs remain, and the distinction is not that nothing is happening to them. Mars square Neptune and Mars quincunx Pluto are collective planetary movements. Their effects are not reserved for Gemini, Virgo, Capricorn, Taurus, and Libra. All 12 zodiac signs move through the same larger atmosphere, including the 5 signs receiving the more concrete openings described here. The disrupted momentum, uncertain communication, and sense that plans refuse to stay where you put them can therefore appear throughout the zodiac. For the remaining 7 signs, however, the immediate invitation is different. Rather than forcing action before clarity exists, this week asks you to identify honestly what is confusing you. Give the uncertainty a name instead of allowing it to remain an undefined pressure in the background. Leave your sign in the comments together with one word describing the area that has felt unclear this week. I am watching those responses as they arrive, and if enough of you identify the same underlying pattern across different signs, I will address that pattern directly in a future video. Many of you have also asked in previous videos for every zodiac sign to receive at least some acknowledgement, so the remaining 7 deserve a brief look here. These are not complete readings. They are simply the particular forms that this week's interference is most likely to take. Aries, your frustration can emerge through impatience with people who seem incapable of moving at your speed. Mars rules you, and Mars is also the planet directly involved in producing much of this week's confusion, so its friction reaches your experience with unusual immediacy. You may feel ready to move while everything around you appears determined to hesitate. Cancer, your signal takes another form. Pay attention to a sudden desire to withdraw toward home, especially when the commitments already written into your schedule seem to demand that you remain elsewhere, because that instinct to retreat is where your particular experience of this week's static begins to reveal itself. The fog does not disappear simply because you finally understand where it came from, and this is where the next part of the week becomes more important than merely knowing which 5 signs are standing closest to the clearer openings. Neptune has been softening the boundaries Cancer normally relies on around rest, privacy, and emotional retreat, which is why Cancer may suddenly feel a stronger need to return home or pour inward, even when the calendar insists that there are other places to be. Leo experiences this atmosphere differently. The Sun, which rules Leo, is not being directly struck by the more difficult planetary relationships shaping this week, yet that does not make Leo completely untouched. Instead, Leo may find itself surrounded by people who are confused, inconsistent, distracted, or unable to decide what they actually want. And simply being close to that uncertainty can make the week feel more complicated than it truly is for Leo personally. Scorpio has another experience, entirely because Pluto belongs directly to Scorpio, and the uncomfortable quincunx involving Pluto moves through territory that Scorpio recognizes at a deep level. Rather than creating one obvious confrontation, it can produce a slow, internal pressure that keeps returning to something Scorpio would prefer not to disturb. You may know exactly which part of your life this refers to because it is probably the thing you keep telling yourself can remain exactly as it is. The pressure does not necessarily demand immediate destruction or dramatic change. It simply refuses to let you forget that an adjustment is waiting. Sagittarius receives a softer secondary effect because Jupiter rules Sagittarius, and Jupiter is participating in the supportive sextile with Venus. Sagittarius may therefore experience some of the warmth and generosity of this alignment, even without being one of the signs receiving the direct reading. Think of it as being close enough to an open window to feel some of the fresh air entering the room. Something fortunate may happen around you through another person, or because you happened to be present when generosity was already moving through the situation. Aquarius also has a meaningful connection because Saturn shares rulership of Aquarius, so the Mercury and Saturn trine may register as an unexpected clearing of the mind. After a period when thoughts seemed harder to organize, one idea may suddenly become much easier to understand, and the relief may be noticeable precisely because the previous mental atmosphere felt so uncertain. Pisces has perhaps the most intimate relationship with the confusion itself because Neptune rules Pisces. For everyone else, Neptune can feel like unfamiliar weather arriving without instructions. For Pisces, this atmosphere is much closer to familiar territory. That does not mean Pisces experiences no uncertainty. It means Pisces may understand how to move through ambiguity more instinctively than people who become alarmed the moment a boundary loses definition. But there is a warning that applies to every sign now, and it deserves more attention than any prediction of opportunity, because Mars and Neptune combinations have a recognizable way of creating mistakes. Read anything important twice before signing it. Do not make a commitment during a rush of inspiration while assuming the details will somehow become obvious later. Neptune tends to blur boundaries before consequences become fully visible. So a choice made under emotional intensity this week may appear noticeably different by August 21st than it appeared when you first made it. The lesson is not to become afraid of every decision. The lesson is to stop demanding immediate resolution from situations that are still genuinely unclear. Some things are allowed to remain unanswered for a little longer, while you still act on the opportunities that have already become specific. Those two behaviors do not contradict each other. You can move confidently toward what is defined while refusing to force definition onto what remains uncertain. Until Mars has completely moved beyond its square with Neptune, that distinction matters. Imagine two situations side by side. In the first, somebody presents you with the formal opportunity, containing clear conditions, understandable expectations, and details you can repeat accurately. That belongs to the Mercury and Saturn side of this week, and it gives you something solid enough to engage with directly. In the second situation, you leave a conversation feeling excited and strangely inspired, but when you try to explain what was actually agreed upon, the details keep slipping away. You remember the emotion more clearly than the decision. That is much closer to the signature of Neptune, and the wiser response is to revisit the conversation after a few days, rather than immediately placing your name beneath something you cannot yet describe. Excitement is not the test. Clarity is. Ask yourself whether you could explain the agreement to another person right now using simple language and precise details. If you cannot do that without filling the gaps with assumptions, then the situation probably deserves more time. There is no need to turn this realization into another source of pressure. In fact, after everything this week has been carrying, the most useful practice may be surprisingly simple. Instead of treating the entire emotional atmosphere as one enormous problem, begin separating what you are feeling according to the planetary pattern behind it. When confusion appears, recognize Neptune. When the persistent pressure to alter something appears, recognize Pluto. When an actual communication, invitation, offer, or relational opening arrives with recognizable edges, notice Mercury or Venus. Naming the threads individually will not magically remove the uncertainty, but it can stop you from assigning equal importance to every sensation moving through you. That is crucial because some of what you feel this week is simply atmospheric weather, while some of it represents an actual doorway. The deeper lesson is learning to distinguish those two experiences while they are happening rather than understanding them only after everything has passed. This applies regardless of your zodiac sign. If you want to make the distinction tangible, take whatever you can write with and place 3 things currently occupying your thoughts in front of you. Beside each one, use only one description, clear or foggy. Do not defend your answer. Do not analyze why. Do not turn the exercise into another complicated problem to solve. Let your first honest response decide. The things that feel clear are the places where this week supports movement. The things that remain foggy are the places where patience is more useful than pressure. Many people are surprised by how quickly their internal landscape becomes organized once they stop insisting that every unresolved issue deserves the same urgency. And all of these threads tighten around August 19th. The first quarter moon reaches its turning point. The Mercury and Saturn connection and the Venus and Jupiter connection are inside their most concentrated window, and the friction created by Mars with Neptune and Pluto is reaching its strongest overlap. The fact that these separate movements converge around the same point is exactly what makes August 19th the hinge of this entire week. Confusion and clarity are not taking turns. They are becoming loud together. Astrologers sometimes describe this kind of convergence as a stacked transit day, a period when several independent planetary cycles happen to intersect within the same 24-hour span through the ordinary mathematics of their orbital timing. This is not something that appears every week, or even every month. Under more typical circumstances, these 5 separate influences could unfold across 10 or 12 days, giving each one enough space to be felt on its own. This time they are compressed into 5 days, with August 19th carrying the greatest concentration of nearly all of them. That compression explains why this week may have seemed disproportionately intense, even when nothing objectively catastrophic happened. Several separate signals are demanding attention within the same narrow period, and your mind and emotions are trying to process them simultaneously. If circumstances allow, leave some space in your evening on August 19th. This is not because a dramatic event must occur, or because you need to prepare for some inevitable crisis. The value of making room is simple. The lunar signal, Mercury, Venus, and Mars are all reaching important points together, and periods of concentrated movement tend to reward presence more than relentless productivity. For the 5 signs identified earlier, there is a practical implication. If the message, invitation, opportunity, or concrete opening has already reached you, August 19th is the day to consider responding rather than automatically delaying for several more days, simply because waiting has become familiar. The first quarter moon supports choosing movement even when the choice is not perfectly polished. For the remaining 7 signs, the task is different. Use that day to write down whatever has felt most confusing during the week. You are not required to solve it. The act of placing the uncertainty into your own handwriting is enough, because it separates the problem from the larger emotional noise surrounding it. If you followed this channel since the Lion's Gate a couple of weeks ago, you may recognize something familiar in the structure. This week carries a smaller and faster expression of that same basic pattern. Release and uncertainty woven together with authentic opportunity, requiring you to hold both experiences without confusing one for the other. The scale has changed. Instead of an extended cosmic sequence, the lesson is concentrated into 1 week, yet the skill underneath it remains the same. You are practicing how to recognize a genuine signal, while noise is arriving in a form that can initially look just as convincing. What began during that earlier journey is being tested here in a more immediate environment. But do not expect August 19th to end, and every complicated feeling to disappear instantly. Mars remains square, Neptune until August 20th, and its difficult relationship with Pluto continues until approximately the same time. The day following the hinge is therefore unlikely to feel completely resolved. Imagine the volume being reduced by roughly 20% rather than the entire system suddenly becoming silent. This matters psychologically because when people expect immediate relief, gradual improvement can be misinterpreted as evidence that nothing has changed. The easing is still occurring. It simply happens in stages. Think about actual morning fog. It rarely lifts from an entire landscape in one perfectly synchronized movement. One section becomes visible while another remains hidden, and several minutes later another part of the view begins to emerge. Give the atmosphere through the weekend before deciding whether the tension of this week has truly released. That patience also applies to the people around you. Someone close to you may have seemed unusually scattered, irritable, inconsistent, or difficult to understand over the last several days. They may be moving through exactly the same collective conditions without having any framework for what they are experiencing. You do not have to explain Mars and Neptune to them. In many cases, simply acknowledging that they seem to be carrying more than usual will reach them more effectively than offering an astrological diagnosis. People trying to find their way through confusion often do not need an explanation of the mechanism while they are still inside it. What they may need first is the experience of being noticed. And none of this week stands alone, because what develops now is quietly preparing the ground for August 28th, when the lunar eclipse in Pisces arrives as the second major eclipse of this season. Keep that date somewhere in your awareness, whether you use a physical calendar or simply remember it mentally. There is no requirement to begin preparing for it now. The reason to remember the date is perspective. Weeks like this become easier to understand when you know approximately where the larger sequence is moving instead of experiencing each threshold as an isolated event with no relationship to what came before or what follows next. Eclipses operate in pairs. The solar eclipse on August 12th initiated something. The friction of this week is applying pressure to what began there, testing which parts can remain stable and which parts need to loosen before anything can properly establish itself. Then the lunar eclipse on August 28th reveals the result. That is why the way you respond to a concrete opening this week, or the honesty with which you acknowledge what remains confusing, can carry more significance than the same choice might carry during an ordinary Tuesday. This pairing is one of the more consistent patterns used in astrology, including among astrologers who disagree strongly about many other interpretations. A solar eclipse begins a process, then a lunar eclipse arrives approximately 2 weeks afterward along a connected axis and brings revelation or release. The days between those eclipses are not meaningless, space separating two dramatic events. They are the quieter territory where the underlying work develops away from the attention each eclipse receives individually. This week falls directly inside that interval. That helps explain why these days can feel consequential, even though there may be no single spectacular event you can point toward as the reason. When you look back across the entire structure, the pattern becomes easier to see. 3 planets are generating friction and noise. 2 supportive planetary connections are creating specific openings beneath that noise. 1 lunar phase is demanding movement whether certainty feels complete or not. Wherever you stand inside that combination, the central lesson remains the same. You are learning how to tell the difference between interference and an actual doorway when both seem equally loud. That ability sounds simple until life asks you to practice it in real time. Most weeks do not place the distinction in front of you this directly. This week does. So if everything else in this video eventually fades from memory, keep one idea with you. A loud feeling does not automatically deserve an immediate response. Some experiences are asking you to pay attention and act. Others are asking only to be noticed before they move through you. There is an easy way to remember the difference. A real door usually has boundaries you can identify. There is a particular person. There is a particular date. There is a particular request, invitation, condition, or decision that you could describe if somebody asked you what happened. Noise behaves differently. Noise spreads. It can feel like uneasiness without a recognizable source, or like the conviction that something is wrong, even though you cannot identify what the something actually is. When you are uncertain which one you are dealing with, try describing the situation in one ordinary sentence that has a clear beginning and a clear ending. If you can do that, you are probably looking at a door. If every attempt to explain it creates 3 more explanations and the story becomes less defined the longer you speak, you are probably dealing with noise. During this week especially, noise is permitted to move through your life without demanding an answer from you. Whether your zodiac sign appeared among the 5 or among the other 7, all 12 signs have moved through these same 5 days together. Some experienced the period as an opening, while others experienced mostly interference, but the collective planetary movements crossed the entire zodiac. Remember that the next time a similar week arrives because another one eventually will. Mars forms a square with Neptune approximately every 2 years, although the overlap with Pluto and the lunar cycle is rarely arranged with this degree of precision. The deeper difference is not created solely by the transit itself. It comes from how you respond when a period like this appears. Your response can determine whether you remember the week only as something that happened around you, or whether you eventually look back and recognize it as the moment when you chose to move. There is also one final layer beneath all of this, and it has less to do with which 5 signs were named than with what a week like this exposes about your relationship with opportunity itself. Pay attention to what happens inside you when something useful arrives without requiring a battle. Can you trust an opening when it comes with relative ease, or has some part of you quietly learned to believe that anything valuable must first demand struggle? Neither belief is permanent. Neither has to define what you choose next. But a week this concentrated can bring the pattern into view because it gives you several experiences in only a few days, enough material to notice how you instinctively respond. For some people, that recognition alone may feel like the real turning point. If you are Gemini, Virgo, Capricorn, Taurus, or Libra, and something has already appeared this week, share in the comments what form it actually took. Was it a message, an invitation, a conversation, an offer, or something that initially looked smaller before revealing more significance? I want to see how closely the pattern is showing itself while these transits are still active. If you belong to one of the other 7 signs, share your sign and describe what these days have genuinely felt like for you, because the next video will be shaped directly around the patterns appearing in what you share. If this approach to astrology focused on the mechanism happening in real time rather than prediction without explanation helps you understand your own experience more clearly, subscribe and consider sharing this video with a person in your life who has spent the week saying that something simply feels different. They may have been sensing the same atmosphere without knowing how to name it. Like the video, if any part of this reflected what you have been experiencing. Thank you for being here and giving this time your attention. Wednesday is approaching, and the invitation now is simply to notice what arrives. It may be the message you were waiting for. It may be the offer that finally has clear edges. It may be nothing more dramatic than recognizing which uncertainty you no longer need to carry as though it requires an immediate solution. Whatever form this week takes for you, you are never being asked to navigate every signal flawlessly. The task was always smaller and more human than that. Notice enough to know what is real, recognize what is still unclear, and choose the next movement with your eyes open. That is the lesson underneath the noise, and that is all this moment has been asking from you.